Okay, one thing, since I can't see the audience, you're going to have to be careful here. But one of the traditions is to see if some of you would like a soft. Oh!
Oh my gosh.
One more. There you go. What's that?
The legacy of his success in politics in the United States.
Yeah, you support coffee for good one. Okay, well, what we're going to do is take another voyage to the moon. We'll do this fairly quickly. I'll fill in some blanks from what you've already heard. This introductory picture is one of the more important from the Apollo 17 mission, in that those boulders you see around there, it turned out to be possible to orient those boulders. And Ben Weiss at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and his crew have actually been able to determine the paleo orientation for the lunar magnetic field 3.7 billion years ago from those boulders. So it's more than just an introductory slide. I also wanted to introduce you to the crew of Apollo 11 before they were famous. There you see Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong and Mike Collins there with yours truly and Ken Mattingly, we heard about earlier. And this picture actually was taken, again, in Mission Control Center as we waited for the acquisition of signal as Apollo 8 was coming home. The reason that the expressions are somewhat grim is because we hadn't received it yet. But it did turn out to come right at the right time, and that really extraordinary mission was complete. It was a mission that, at least for those of us who worked in mission control at the time, was probably as exciting, if not more exciting, even than parts of Apollo 11, because we never expected to do that. That mission was conceived in August of 1968 and flown after the successful flight of Apollo 7, flown in December of 1968. It was the brainchild of George Low, about whom you heard earlier, and really was something that got the attention of the entire crew, and I think the entire Apollo team. It was really a remarkable success. Now, our Saturn V was a remarkable vehicle because it carried the largest payload of any of the Saturn V's. I always suspected that Werner von Braun actually could have had that payload on the first Saturn V, but he kept doling out additional mass for each mission. Our mission actually carried 44 metric tons to translunar insertion. The spacecraft you've heard about, if you look very carefully, however, you'll see on the left-hand side of the Saturn V some bright spots. Those are chunks of ice coming off our vehicle. We actually had to hold on the pad for 2 hours in Florida now, for 2 hours and 40 minutes, while they worked a problem with the launch control computer. It was a problem that the launch director, Skip Chauvin, within 5 minutes had assured me and the rest of the crew that it was not going to be a problem, that they had a fix. But as you can imagine, it took at least 2 hours to convince management that the fix was correct. That's sometimes the way things go. But even in Apollo, I want to remind you that between the mission of Apollo 7 in November of 1968 and the Apollo 12 mission in November of 1969, the team that Charlie talked about launched an Apollo Saturn class mission every 2 months. And that team consisted of people whose average age was less than 30, far less than 30. Just a remarkable period of time, as we've heard. The Lunar Module Challenger, resting on the lunar surface in the lower right-hand portion of this of this view was one of three what we call Block 2 lunar modules. The earlier lunar modules could not carry the kind of payload that we carried on the last three missions. And the Challenger and the two earlier flights of the Block 2 lunar module could do that. That meant that we could spend a full 3 days on the moon, we could carry extra scientific experiments, and just really turn Apollo into a true exploration program. This is a view, one of the many views we had in Earth orbit. I just want to call your attention to that blue horizon. I'm going to be mentioning that a little bit later. This is a picture taken over the South Atlantic. The one picture you have not seen is the S4B, the third stage of the Saturn system. And here it is surrounded by more flakes of ice. It's the only part of the spacecraft that actually did not lose the ice during the launch vibration. And it was a remarkable sight for me as I look back and as Ron Evans flew the spacecraft America to a docking with the Challenger in its cocoon at the end of the S4B. Soon after we had the Challenger in tow, I was able to begin a process of observing various aspects of Earth weather, some of which you see here. And there's a long series of photographs of the Earth taken in 3.5 days while I did that. It was a personal project of mine that came out of my life with a geologist father who also was an amateur meteorologist, and way back in my younger days in New Mexico, we tried to forecast weather. And so on the way to the moon, I was trying to forecast the next day's weather that would be visible to us as we took that trip. And this was one of many of the documentation photographs, became known as the Blue Marble photograph. And you see how systematic the weather patterns are around the southern hemisphere. We actually mostly were viewing the southern hemisphere because of the nature of the trajectory we had in order to go to the northern hemisphere of the moon. And I'm not going to get into that. There's some kids here that can explain that to you, I'm sure, much better than I can. The Apollo 17 landing site was indeed the farthest east and the farthest north of the landing sites, and its relationship to the Apollo 11 landing site, some few years before, is shown by those arrows. Now, I draw your attention to this view of the far side of the moon. It's the first view that we had looking towards the sunrise, and it's not bad for showing the colors or the tints that you would have there. The shadows certainly are obvious, but one thing that of course is missing is there's no blue horizon. There's no significant atmosphere around the moon. It's what they call an exosphere, a very transient atmosphere that has gradually become more and more known to us with various missions that have flown. The Challenger now is familiar to you from other presentations. Really was a remarkable vehicle. By the way, our mission had absolutely no problems. Even the transducers in the Saturn V never failed. They'd been in there for years. It really was remarkable. Well, there was one problem with the fender, as some of you are familiar with, but we won't get into that. It was not mission critical, believe me. This view is one on the orbit before we actually landed in the Valley of Taurus-Littrow. If you look carefully in the center of that picture, there is another spacecraft. That is the spacecraft America. Ron Evans at this point is taking navigational sightings on some craters in the Valley of Taurus-Littrow, the position of which had been determined relative to the center of mass of the moon. Those sightings then gave him a much better state vector. That's the position and velocity in space. For his spacecraft, all that was processed then on the ground and shipped back to the lunar module, so we had a much improved knowledge of our position in space, which enabled us to land in this valley. Had we not had that, our error ellipse actually, although very conservative, would have included the sides of some of those mountains you see. And that did not seem to be a good idea when the site was being evaluated. So we actually delayed the update to our state vector by one orbit in order to shrink that error ellipse. Looking straight down, this picture actually Ron Evans took, looking straight down, and the Challenger, if some of you up close could probably see that little white spot. This is taken after we landed, and what happens as you land, and this happened at all the landing sites from Apollo 11 on, is that it winnows away the dark glasses, fine-grained glasses in the lunar soil, or regolith as we call it, and brightens the area right around the landing point. That enables you, if you fly around the moon, and some of you may be doing that, I don't know whether you will or not, but if you fly around the moon and look carefully at the various landing sites, you can see where these lunar modules are actually located. And in fact, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which is currently in orbit around the moon, taking really fantastic images of various parts of the moon now, it's been up there for over 10 years. Really a remarkable, now unmanned spacecraft. This is a picture of our landing site, and you see the descent stage of the Challenger, more or less in the middle. And if you look carefully over to the lower, partial lower right, there's a dark spot. That's the Lunar Rover parked out over there that took the pictures of our liftoff. And you also see superposed on that bright spot my very irregular tracks headed out to where we deployed the ALSAT. That, the Apollo Lunar Surface Science package, I think I walked right over a better deployment area, not realizing it. And I ended up almost twice as far from the lunar module as we had originally intended. But over on the left-hand side of the picture, all that disturbed area is where that science package was deployed, including an active seismic array, which is that cross that you see in the lower part of that disturbed area. First view that I had out of the Challenger's right-hand window, looking towards the North Massif, north side of the valley. By the way, the valley is deeper than the Grand Canyon of the Colorado in the United States. The North Massif Mountains are 1,600 meters high. The South Massif, as you'll see later, excuse me, are in fact 2,100 meters high. So it's quite a place. The base of those mountains are about 5 kilometers away. That metallic object in the foreground is one of 16 small restartable thrusters, attitude control thrusters. Each one of those had about a 50-pound thrust, and they were used to control the orientation of our spacecraft in flight. Now, I mentioned that 50-pound thrust just to show you that the contrast and the propulsion technology that had to be developed in order to accomplish what Neil Armstrong accomplished. The F1 engine in the first stage of the Saturn V, each one of those engines developed 1.5 million pounds of thrust. And we had several propulsion engines in between all of that. So that was a major part of what enabled us to actually explore the moon and to land there for the first time. What do you need in order to live and work on the moon, at least for 3 days? Well, you need a camp, and that camp is the Challenger back there. You also need another spacecraft, and that's the spaceship. It really is, as you learned this morning, it really is another spacecraft. It operates for 8 to 10 hours, depending on how hard you work. It has the consumables. It has communications. Again, cooling in that water-cooled underwear you were introduced to earlier. But it also has propulsion. and that's yours truly in this case. A little closer view of that spacecraft and the spacesuit. The total weight, my weight, backpack, and everything was about 370 pounds, Earth pounds, about 61 pounds on the moon. And moving was really quite easy for me. There you see me taking strides. Actually, if you look very carefully, I'm actually above the surface, striding off towards the Lunar Rover at the end of our activities at this large crater. The boulder you saw earlier, seen from a different view, along with the front section of the Lunar Rover and the TV camera that provided us some fantastic pictures at the time. That boulder rolled down the mountain about 25 million years ago, left a track behind it, which enabled us to once we had dated the material in that boulder, made up of melted, now cooled, of course, melted rock that was produced by an impact some 3.9 billion years ago. I'm talking big numbers here. The moon's been sitting there for a long time. That's one reason it tells us so much about the Earth, is that it has recorded the early environment of space in the first million years of terrestrial history. But that boulder has given us a great deal of information, including a permanently shadowed sample that I was able to get from underneath rock. Actually for about 25 million years, had never been exposed to sunlight. Some diffuse sunlight probably got in there, but nothing direct. And that is one of the samples that Clive Neal, who's going to talk to you tomorrow, and I and others are going to work on here. NASA's releasing. It had been kept frozen for ever since we collected it, practically, or at least ever since we got it back to Earth. And that and a core that I took earlier in the mission, and a number of other samples are now going to be opened up very carefully and looked at to see how new analytical technology can tell us new things about these samples. They are indeed, as Clive has said, and many have said, the gift that keeps on giving, not only because you have new analytical technology, but you have new ideas. And in science, that's very important, to have new ideas and to question old ideas. That's part of science. In fact, that's where the most of the breakthroughs come from. Now, one of the major finds of Apollo 17 was at this crater we call Shorty Crater. It's off to the right of this picture. It's about 100 meters in diameter, an impact crater that is only 3 million years old. It's where we found the orange soil. Many people were wondering, well, I've never seen orange soil on the moon. Well, now you see it. We've been able, with the help of Ron Wells, a colleague of mine, retired astronomer, by the way, he and his son have worked out ways in which to out of the scans of these Hasselblad photographs, exochrome photographs that we took, to pull out the actual colors based on the descriptions that I gave in real time on the moon. So I described the red and the orange and a little bit of yellowing towards the light-colored edges of this, and that's what we use as control in order to get what the orange soil really looked like. It isn't totally represented right on the back screen that I see. I'm looking at a much better picture here. Sorry about that. It's a little bit too pink in that picture. Take away the pink in your mind and you'll have a much better feeling. Now, I want to get into a little bit of what I consider interesting science, and I hope you will too here. One of the things that we collected on each of the last 3 missions was a deep drill core. And on Apollo 17, we actually were able to get the full core. It's almost 3 meters long, 268 centimeters. And that core, in that core, we're finally beginning to be able to see some of the history of the sun. Right from the very beginning of Apollo, Gene Shoemaker and other colleagues of his argued very strongly and persuasively that the lunar surface, regolith, the debris layer covers the moon, has recorded the history of the sun. We believe that. And even Neil Armstrong had small core tubes in order to get started on that. They were badly designed, unfortunately, and we learned a lot gradually through time on getting a better design for core tubes as well as for this deep drill core. And for finally on Apollo 17, we did get a full core. Now I'm going to, a couple things that we need to, a little tutorial here. My wife says you'll probably get an exam afterwards. Believe me, I won't. The debris layers, the regolith layers within this core can be identified. They're identified primarily on how mature they are. We have a way of telling through by measuring the amount of very fine grain, what we call nanophase iron, in the material of these layers, telling how long they've been exposed to solar wind, to the particles coming from the sun. And that's the lunar surface rock debris produced by billion years of meteor impacts, as well as the sun activity. The maturity, as I said, is a measure of the time exposed to the solar wind, sputtering, and meteor impact. There is an index of that maturity that is an objective measure of maturity, and that's going to be important here in a moment. And for this particular core, we were fortunate that very early in the history of the measurement and the analysis of these Apollo samples, a team actually in Germany measured the nitrogen isotope ratios. And one way that we measure those is with this Del 15N indication that I have there in white. It's just a measure of the stable isotopes of nitrogen, the ratios of 15 versus 14 nitrogen isotope. And that's then compared to the Earth atmosphere standard. Negative numbers of that measure show that the light isotope will indicate a light isotope is more abundant. Now, very quickly here, I'm going to take the maturity index that was measured at the point in the core where each of those nitrogen measurements were made, and also remind you that one of the layers we actually have an approximate date for when that crater, when that layer was formed. It's called Camelot Crater. About 3 years ago, we were able to get what's called a topographic diffusion date on that crater. It's not very precise, obviously. It's 500 plus 200 million years, plus or minus 200 million years, but it'll come out to be very important here in a moment, and it's probably better than that, but we'll wait and see. But when you plot that maturation index against the nitrogen ratio, you get a straight line. Well, that tells you that the more mature the soil is, the more nitrogen 14, the light isotope, has been lost. That's, for some reason, nobody ever plotted that before until about a few months ago when I said that might be something of interest. All of the layers that were sampled fall near that line or form that line except for one. And we'll talk about that some more in a minute. That's the topmost layer. S is the topmost layer in the core. Again, that shows you that light isotope 14N is lost relative to the heavy isotope 15N during maturation. Now, when you correct for maturation, which now we can do because we have that slope of that curve, it turns out that we get, for the lower portions of the core, most of the core, what the solar wind nitrogen ratio was whenever those layers were put in. And it turns out they're very consistent. They're, as you can see, 105, minus 105, plus or minus 5. And to my knowledge, it's the first time we really have been able to measure an ancient ratio of the solar wind. But two of those measurements don't fit when you correct it for maturation using that original curve. But if you, and you have to ask yourself why, and it turns out that seems to be the two cores. One of them is one has come from the crater, a date for which we now have. So we draw a new curve. The original curve, and then the green here shows you the new curve, which indicates an increase in the rate of maturity, rate of maturation of the lunar surface. And one way in which, about the only way that I've been able to think of how that can happen, is the sun changed. About 500 million years ago, the sun became brighter. There was an increase in luminosity. I don't know any other way to increase the rate of maturation on the lunar surface. By a factor of 1.7, and that's significant. Now, something apparently happened to the solar wind 500 million years ago, plus or minus something. There was an increase in solar wind regolith maturation. But what else happened in, shall we say, cislunar space 500 million years ago? Well, I know there are a few geologists in the crowd, and they all know about something that happened about that time, and it's called the Cambrian Explosion here on Earth. It's when there was a vast increase in the amount and the diversification of fossils. That's been known for some time, and recently it's being confirmed again and again. It started in Canada, the evidence was there. Now China is coming up with all sorts of new information about that same period of time, about 540 million years ago, when life really began to expand here on Earth, including all the phyla of which we are representative of one. Was it a warmer Earth because of this increase in luminosity? Well, we'll keep working on that question, but that's a real possibility, I think. Anyway, let's get back to the moon. I wanted to make sure you knew that things are happening. They're still happening, and will continue to happen throughout with these lunar samples. I said the other day that there's an Apollo mission going on continuously with the examination of the soils that each of these missions brought back. In fact, the Apollo 11 collection was one of the most fantastic that we got. Neil Armstrong did an amazing job of collecting not only basaltic samples and compressed regolith samples, but also he collected a soil sample. As he put it, the box looked awfully empty, so I just filled it up with dirt. And that dirt has turned out to be the basis for us initial understanding of what the resource potential of the lunar surface is going to be, not only for settlements on the moon, but for settlements and exploration of Mars, and potentially even through its energy content, light isotope helium called helium-3, it may well be one of the major, very, very clean energy sources we have here on Earth in the foreseeable future. Well, you can see that I've gotten quite dirty. Charlie told you about falling on his back, and that, by the way, was hilarious. He just rotated out of the picture. I don't remember any of us being worried about you, Charlie. I think we had more confidence in the suit than you did. But maybe we just didn't understand the problem. That's usually the case. But in my case, I fell all the time. You've seen many of the pictures, some of you have, I'm sure. And I just never worried about it. I probably should have, but I never did. That suit was extraordinarily well built. Our friends at ILC, International Latex Corporation in Dover, Delaware, just did a remarkable job with the suit itself. And of course, the engineers working on the portable life support system on your back and everything else. Just, it was magnificent. Nobody, as has been said, ever wanted to think that they were responsible for a problem. I also might point out that distended vein in my forehead is another illustration of what you heard about this morning, and that is the movement of fluid to the upper parts of the body in reduced gravity, lunar gravity being 1/6 of that of the Earth. It was starting to dissipate by the time we were finished on the moon, but still there was some of that. And people have asked me, do I think we were adapting to lunar gravity while we were there? And I think we were. I can't speak for anybody else. I just had that feeling that we were becoming very adapted to that new environment, and that's important. We need to quantify that, but that's very important when you think about long duration flight to Mars. That my strong belief is that astronauts going to Mars will adapt fairly quickly to the 3H gravity on Mars, and that that will probably not be a significant problem. Well, we did not get a good picture of liftoff. Nobody did. The commander asked me if I'd go out and get that picture, and I decided that maybe we'd leave that to the future settlers of the moon. About half a G acceleration, hardly noticeable as a matter of fact, and we were on our way. Rendezvous with Ron Evans went very well. We had, that's the picture of the scientific equipment bay that the last 3 missions also had, with different kinds of instruments and cameras in it. Our splashdown in the Pacific was very normal, except for the fact it was the last one for the Apollo series. I've been asked recently, was I thinking about that during the mission? And the answer is no. I didn't think about it. I didn't. You're totally concentrating on your mission and your job and making sure it's done right and well. Now, just quickly, let me drop back to Apollo 11. I mentioned earlier fantastic suite of samples and things, but Apollo 11 I think had one major legacy. It was an essential contribution at the time to the continuation of humankind's experiment in individual freedom. That was the competition at that time. And Apollo 11 made that contribution. We also, as I hope I've suggested, gained new and unique knowledge of the first billion years of Earth history. That was not available to us. The Earth is a very dynamic place. It's largely erased. One exception I won't go into, but it's largely erased any of that first billion years of Earth history, and it was a very violent time. There was a very diverse mineralogical condition here on Earth, and it was when life was beginning. Life was beginning in an extraordinarily violent time. And that is a question that we have not yet answered. How did that happen? Somehow these complex organic molecules got organized and have become, and gradually became what we see today. And also provided, as I indicated earlier from Neil's sample, knowledge of the resources necessary for human settlement on the moon and Mars and for longer ventures beyond. And, of course, the technological foundations for advancement of the human condition were laid, or at least enhanced once again. That's happened in the past through a variety of circumstances. It's certainly happened with Apollo. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.